Let's see here. Yes, I posted the exam 2 topics list today. Remember, this is just a heads up of stuff that may show up on the exam. The way you're going to work this is identify it, who, what, when, and where, and then state the significance, how it's important, why it's important, cause, consequence, things like that. Work that into a study guide to help you put your notes in some order, help you get your reading materials in order as well. Let's see here. We need to finish up with our look at American imperialism, and then we're going to work a little bit on World War I today. Let's start off here with this one. All right. And we'll click A. And now back to business. We left off with the rationales for the new diplomacy, some justifications for why we're going to take such a drastic step away from tradition into a new direction here. Now, we started off listing economics as the main rationale. This was Senator Albert Beveridge, pretty much his idea that this is a done deal. Fate has already decided this. This is something that we have to do. It's not something that we can ignore. It's going to happen, so let's make it happen. And this gets a wide acceptance. Businessmen argue that they could pay higher wages. Investors argue that they could earn higher returns. Farmers and workers argue they could make more money, pay off their debts easier. So this has got a broad support here. Then we talked a little bit about the military rationale and the ideas of Alfred Thayer Mahan, the naval historian who's trying to figure out why great civilizations become great. His two conclusions were that they all do business far away from their homeland and that they have large, powerful navies that protect their commercial fleets. So Mahan suggests that the United States should do this as well. We should build a two-ocean navy so that we can protect our far-flung business interests. We should acquire some island colonies to use as refueling stations or supply bases, and then think about getting a canal someplace across Central America. He also stressed the military threat of the new technological age. Now we're in the age of steam-powered ships with big guns and heavy armor plating. Now it's perfectly reasonable to expect that some foreign power could build a huge navy, load on a lot of soldiers, be here with an invasion force within days before we had a chance to respond. So his suggestion was, get prepared now. Start building this new modern navy. Now, I'm going to group a couple of other ones here in what I would call intellectual rationales. And here we've got a couple of guys that give us some insight into what's going on. The first is our good old buddy Frederick Jackson Turner and his frontier thesis. He just keeps coming back to haunt us, doesn't he? 1890, right about when all of this foreign policy stuff and the new diplomacy is starting to come into focus, here comes Turner saying that the one thing that had made us great all along is now gone. Now, Turner never said it, But everybody who reads Turner, like Albert Beveridge and Theodore Roosevelt, John Hay, they all say, wow, Turner's got it right. What happens to us now that the one thing that made us great is gone? Well, let's just find new frontiers. Let's move outside the continent and find new frontiers in new parts of the world. Another guy that has a huge influence here is a Congregationalist minister named Josiah Strong. Now, the Congregationalists used to be known as the Puritans. And all the way back to 1630, when they first landed here and created Massachusetts Bay, they had what they called a sense of mission, their mission to the world. They believed that they were on a mission from God, that God gave them instructions to come to the New World to create this model community that would serve as an example for everybody else to follow. And so this has been one of the central ideas of the congregational thought all along. Now it comes back 200 years later, and Strong resurrects this idea of a mission. Now, he is quite right in that quite often the first Americans in some of these foreign countries are missionaries. Yes, there we go. That have gone there for religious reasons, to try to convert these other non-white, non-Christian people to probably Protestant Christianity. And they're going there out of this sense of duty, this sense of purpose. Businessmen come along after receiving reports from the missionaries that the people are friendly and they're receptive to American ideas and American ways. Then the businessmen will come in. And then only later, of course, does the national government come in. But Strong has resurrected this idea of a mission. He says now our mission as a nation is to go out into the world to spread American civilization to the, as he said, quote, the lesser people of the earth, unquote. Now this is pretty racist, pretty arrogant, and certainly very Amerocentric. But this is also what most Americans believed at the time, that we were special, that we were exceptional, that we had things to offer the rest of the world that could improve the lives of all of these third world people. And so it is not only to our benefit and our necessity to go do this, it's to their benefit to follow our lead. And so this combines then with Turner and the military and the economic rationale to convince more and more people that this again is an inevitability, that we have to do this in order to be a great nation. And the last one here, several of them that I'll group under this title here of political rationales. One reason for this new outward focus is simple practical politics. If things at home are messy, then let's deflect people's attention to something else. If things are going wrong here like they were in the 1890s, let's look someplace else. Get people looking someplace else, and perhaps they won't notice all these domestic troubles, or it won't seem as important. And so that was one reason. A second reason is that, again, it contributes to this sense of American greatness. The idea that America is a great country, and great countries, like Mahan said, have colonies. They have influence and power, and they use that power for their own benefit. And so a lot of people are saying, now's the time that we start to assert ourselves. This new diplomacy, then, has a broad bipartisan appeal. It's not a Republican thing, it's not a Democratic thing. Because again, just like progressivism, you've got two Republican presidents doing this and a Democratic president doing this in this time period. And so it's very much bipartisan, or at least nonpartisan. There's little disagreement on party lines whether we should be doing this or not. And lastly here, the majority of the American people seem to have accepted this new role. Certainly by 1898, have been convinced that the United States is on the cusp of greatness and that now's the time to assert ourselves, to take a more activist, interventionist role in the world. So let me ask you here, how did Americans justify this new diplomacy? How did Americans justify the new diplomacy? Awfully quiet out there. Awfully slow getting in. Okay, red zone. And the results. Ooh. 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 Let's try this again. Consult your notes. Consult with your colleagues. Oops, there we go. What's the most logical answer here? Okay, a little more discussion this time. Red zone, hurry up. Okay. Did Americans justify a more action in world affairs, or the new diplomacy, because it would restore the global balance of power? No, it would upset the global balance of power because we're the new kids that are going to upset things. So it can't be that one. What about C? No, what's it going to do here? It's probably going to create potential conflicts and confrontations. So it can't be E. So now A or B? Is it A? No. Well, let's see. There you go. Correct answer is B. It would ease domestic political tensions, get people turned away, thinking about other things. That's one of the reasons, not the only. The Spanish-American War of 1898, generally considered by most historians to be the turning point, or that final point that pushes us from the old diplomacy into the new. It's our first foreign war in 50 years, and it's going to mark America's entry onto the world stage. Now, this thing begins really without a whole lot of influence from the United States. Begins in 1895 in Cuba. 1895, the Cubans begin yet another rebellion against Spain. Now, Cuba is one of Spain's last remaining colonies. Spain controlled a good portion if not half, of the New World for a long time. But now, 400 years later, Cuba is really her last Western Hemisphere possession. And during this 400 years of rule, the Cubans have occasionally tried to overthrow the Spanish, gain their independence. They've never been successful. Now, the United States, remember, is heavily invested in Cuba. American businesses already there, already doing business. For example, it's a Spanish colony, but Spain only does $2 million a year business with Cuba, whereas the United States does $50 million a year in business. So we've already established kind of this informal economic dominance there, even though it's a Spanish colony. There's a couple of things that are going to get this, bring this to the Americans' attention. One is sympathy for the Cuban rebels. We identify the Cuban rebels as being freedom fighters. In fact, the newspapers referred to them as our little brown brothers and sisters who were following in our footsteps to throw off a corrupt Catholic regime and establish their independence. And so public opinion becomes an important factor in forming and shaping this new foreign policy. Leaders cannot ignore what the American people are thinking and feeling and saying. So we've sided with the freedom fighters. This is an emotional support. On the other hand, you've got the yellow press that's stirring things up as well. Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, the two leading newspaper corporations in the country, are in this battle for domination of the news industry. They both send reporters down to cover this rebellion. One of Hearst's reporters writes back, says, well, there's really not much of a rebellion going on. There's really not much to write about. Hearst supposedly says, you provide the stories, I'll provide the war. Thus, giving you an idea of the influence now that American businessmen have in shaping foreign policy. Now, the yellow press is going to stir up public emotion here. Nothing sells newspapers like good, sensational, lurid, exciting stories. And so both sides are going to, shall we say, exaggerate things, which probably doesn't surprise you in this age of fake news. I wouldn't probably call what they were doing fake news, but it was certainly exaggerated news. They'd print stories about gangs of Spanish soldiers roaming the streets, gang raping young Cuban women, and stories about how Spanish soldiers would go into the hospitals and grab little babies out of their cribs. And they had this game where they'd throw the baby up in the air, and whichever soldier could stab it first with his bayonet would win a prize. And then they'd cut the dead baby's head off, and they'd use it for a soccer ball. And all of these stories get printed in the American newspapers, and the American public is outraged by this. The brutality, the inhumanity. And they start demanding that something be done. They're not specific, but something needs to be done here. Now this starts in 1895. The U.S. officially declares neutrality. President Cleveland is in his last year as president, and he makes it clear that this is not the United States' concern, that this is between Spain and Cuba, and the United States is going to stay out. Well, 1896, McKinley becomes president, and at least initially, promises to follow Cleveland's policy of neutrality. But McKinley, being heavily influenced by the business community, starts to take a harder line against Spain. As time rolls on here, American businesses and American citizens are getting caught in the crossfire between these two opposing groups. And so American businessmen are pressuring McKinley to take some kind of action to protect American lives and property. Well, McKinley doesn't seem like he wants to get terribly involved, so he starts using diplomatic pressure, trying to pressure Spain into making certain that Americans are not caught in the crossfire, making sure that Spain will guarantee the safety of American lives and property. And Spain says, yeah, well, we'll do our best, but you probably shouldn't be there in the first place, which doesn't make McKinley or the American public very happy. So now as this starts to disintegrate even further, McKinley hints that the American government may be forced to act if Spain proves unable to put down this rebellion. And so the business community, again, showing its influence here. Now, the turning point in American policy comes in early 1898. Two things are going to happen kind of back to back. One is the publication of what was known as the Delome letter. Delome was the Spanish foreign minister, their version of Secretary of State. And he writes this letter to the Spanish ambassadors here, saying that he thinks McKinley is weak, that McKinley's a pansy, that he talks big but he won't do anything, just like the American people, a bunch of cowards who won't stand up and won't fight. Well, too bad for Delome, this letter got intercepted and published in all the newspapers, and you can imagine the American public was outraged by this. Don't be calling us cowards and pansies, and certainly don't be insulting our president. The American public demands an apology. Well, before that can fully unfold, there's another event. McKinley sends the USS Maine down to Havana Harbor. Now the Maine is, well, it may be a battleship and it may not be. Naval historians debate whether it was a battleship or a heavy cruiser. And I personally think that distinction doesn't need to be made. It was a great big ship and it had lots of great big guns on it. And McKinley orders it to go down and park right in the middle of Havana Harbor. And all of its guns are pointing up at the governor, General Weyler's house. And every morning when General Weyler gets up and he opens his curtains and he looks out on the harbor while he's sipping his Starbucks latte, he sees this big, huge, gleaming American ship, all of its guns pointed on it. McKinley's trying to send a message here, right? He might as well get his Twitter account and say, "Yo, Weyler, I got something for your ass." Okay? That's pretty much what he's saying here. That if you don't take action, I might use this thing. Well, early morning hours of February 15th, 1898, a huge explosion rips through the Maine, breaks the ship in half, and it sinks within 15 minutes. Now, this is the picture that gets published in the front page of all the American newspapers the next morning. It says, "Maine blows up, Spain to blame." So the yellow press immediately blames Spanish sabotage. The Spanish, for their part, go, wait, we didn't do this. We don't want any trouble with you. We wouldn't be that stupid. So McKinley sees this, and he sees it as a way to build and shape public opinion. Now look at what's going on here in this picture. Look at this. Bodies flying hundreds of feet up into the air. Flames shooting up, just like you're looking down into the mouth of hell itself. The explosion was so big and so loud it shattered windows for miles away from the harbor. The sons of bitches knocked down the American flag. Now, I don't care who you are, if you're an American, that pisses you off. So this is what the American public sees. And Juan Carlos, King of Spain, and General Weyler, the military governor, clearly are to blame for this. McKinley sends a team of naval investigators down to find out what really happened. Well, they do their investigation, they come back and they file their report. They give it to McKinley, and it says, well, it could have been Spanish sabotage, but we really don't have any evidence for that. It's also quite possible that one of our own sea mines got loose and bumped into the ship, and we blew ourselves up. The Maine has a sister ship, I believe it was the USS Oregon, that about 6 months before reported a spontaneous combustion fire in the coal storage locker, which was right next to the ammunition locker. And so it's quite possible that a combustion fire started and set off all this ammunition. On the other hand, this class of ship was known to have very poor electrical systems, so it might have been an electrical spark that set off the gunpowder. McKinley takes this report, which is inconclusive, lays it on his desk, and lets the American people continue to think that Spain did this on purpose. Again, listening to public opinion, listening to the business community, pressuring him to do something. So in April of 1898, a couple of weeks after this, he goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war. And the Congress, before they actually approved the declaration of war, because there's a large number of senators who are still not convinced that imperialism is where we should be going, attach a document known as the Teller. The other way. There we go. The Teller Amendment to the Declaration of War. The Teller Amendment says, in no uncertain terms, the United States will not annex Cuba. We are fighting this war only to help the Cubans gain their independence. And soon as we're done, we're out of there. And so now the declaration of war passes. Now, just as an aside, 1976. 1976. Finally, President Jimmy Carter sent another team of naval investigators down with the latest technology, and they conclusively proved that it was a spontaneous combustion fire in the locker, in the coal locker, that set off the ammunition. So Spain was right. They had nothing to do with this. Nonetheless, it led us straight into war. Now, this war is going to begin and end very quickly. It's the shortest, most lopsided war in American history. Now, even though all of this starts in Cuba, the first action of the war is actually halfway around the world in the Philippines, Spain's other last remaining colony of a once great empire. Admiral Dewey has the American Pacific Fleet in Hong Kong. And as the Congress is debating this declaration of war, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt sends Dewey a telegram saying war is imminent, set sail for the Philippines. Then Teddy Roosevelt resigns as Secretary of the Navy. We'll get back to him in a minute. In the meantime, Dewey's fleet comes and they blockade Manila Bay, where the Spanish ships are at. And the Spanish ships come out of this rather narrow harbor, trying one at a time to attack or to provide a defense against the American ships. But these American ships, we took Mahan's advice. They've got long-range guns and heavy steel armor and steam-powered engines. And the Spanish we're shooting at the Spanish ships and hitting them and sinking them just like you're shooting ducks at the rodeo carnival gallery. The Spanish are firing back, but their shells are falling far short. One afternoon's battle, we destroyed the entire Spanish Pacific Fleet with no loss of American lives. Dewey goes on into port, docks his ships, the Marines disembark, and the Spanish soldiers who are in Manila see U.S. Marines coming at them. They drop their weapons and say, we want no part of you guys, which is probably a smart thing to do. The Filipinos now regard the Americans as liberators. We've thrown off Spanish rule and set them free. Now, meanwhile, back in Cuba, things don't go quite so smooth. The naval battle is almost a repeat of the Philippines because we had followed Mahan's advice and we had modernized the Navy. And so when the American fleet blockades the Spanish fleet in Santiago Harbor, and as the Spanish ships again come out to do battle, we sink them one at a time, wipe out the entire Spanish Atlantic fleet in an afternoon's battle. This time there's 2 American casualties. One guy fell overboard and drowned. One guy died of a heart attack shoveling coal. Mahan was right. The nation that's prepared can strike hard and strike fast and has a definitive advantage in naval warfare. Now, while American troops initially encountered no resistance in the Philippines, that's not going to be the story here in Cuba. The Spanish have about 250,000 troops. The American Army has not been modernized. After it was mustered out at the end of the Civil War, we had a total of about 30,000 men and officers. Half of them were Army Corps of Engineers, so we've only got about 15,000 guys who are actual real combatants, warfighters. And most of them are out here in the Western Plains dealing with the Indians. Well, by the late 1880s, certainly by the 1890s, the Indian threat has been largely subdued. And so the U.S. Army is sitting around in their forts out in the West with really not much to do. And so nobody paid any attention to the Army. As soon as he had issued Dewey's orders to sail to Manila, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Roosevelt resigns and accepts a commission as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. And he's given the chore, the task of putting together a cavalry unit, training them, and taking them to battle in Cuba. So he goes up and down the East Coast, stopping at a bunch of Ivy League colleges, recruiting bored young college guys, very much like some of y'all, looking for some adventure and some fun, something to do. He stops at a few prisons along the way and bails out some criminals. Then he brings this group to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, here in San Antonio, where he hooks them up with the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and the 25th Infantry, also known as the 9th and 10th Cavalry, 24th and 25th Infantry, the all-black segregated units of the United States Army, the Buffalo Soldiers. Now, why did Roosevelt come here and seek the assistance of colored troops? Because they were the best in the Army. The Buffalo Soldiers had been out on the Western Plains fighting the Comanche for 20 years. They were the most experienced, most battle-hardened, most battle-ready group within the American Army. So Roosevelt chose wisely. So now he puts together this force and they train, and he calls them he calls them the Texas Tarantulas. Apparently it didn't catch on, so the newspapers now dub them the Rough Riders. Now Teddy, keep in mind, he's in this as much for himself as he is for his country. Roosevelt believes that participating in war, in armed combat, is a masculine rite of passage. It's proof of masculinity. And so he's just itching to get out there and get in the fight so he can prove what a stud he is, so that he can build up some credibility, because he's got further political ambitions. He has his uniforms specifically tailored by Brooks Brothers in New York, a very high-class outfit. So he looks great wearing these uniforms. He brings the yellow press with him with their cameras so that they can catch him on horseback, and they can catch him with a sword yelling "charge" and leading his troops up the hill. He understands what the media can do to boost his career, and he's not afraid to do that. Well, they bring everything down to Tampa, and they're getting ready. They're waiting for ships to take him down to Cuba. Teddy and the Rough Riders are so anxious to get in battle that they force one of the ship captains at gunpoint to sail early, to take off and drop them in Santiago. Right as they get to Santiago, they realize they left some of their supplies and about half of their horses back in Tampa. So a complete, total disorganization. This descends into this big, hot mess now. You've got about 45,000 American troops going up against 250,000 Spanish troops. Now, the Spanish troops are going to be concentrated in a few fortresses. The big battle, the most famous battle, is the Battle of San Juan Hill, or the Battle of Kettle Hill. It was misnamed, where Roosevelt actually does lead the Rough Riders up. He gets shot at several times, so he's proven himself under fire, and they're successful. They've accomplished their goals. Now, about 379 Americans died liberating Cuba, killed in action. So much more than in the Philippines. But that 379 killed in action is misleading, because by the end of the year, over 5,000 American soldiers had died, mostly of disease, yellow fever and malaria, diseases that had no cures at the time. That, along with accidents and spoiled food, killed quite a few of them. So this is a much different story, capturing and liberating Cuba. Well, Cuba, or Spain, finally sues for peace, and the war is over. Out of this, the United States will emerge as a world power. A world power with an empire. Now, really for the first time, the United States has demonstrated not only our national military power, but our willingness to use it to accomplish our goals. And we earn a brand new found respect from all of the other major nations in the world. See, Spain had a reputation, but they were, well, riding their reputation. They really didn't have much to back it up anymore. So we easily defeated them. But the rest of the nations think, hey, this new upstart group of Americans kicked one of the leading world powers' asses here. We need to take America seriously from now on. They're not going to be able to pursue their own interests without considering what impact the United States is going to have on this. Now, we've also acquired an empire. We've acquired some colonies here in the Pacific, specifically the Philippines. We formally annexed Hawaii. We've picked up a couple of other islands a little bit earlier, like Guam. Not clear, and certainly in the case of the Philippines, not with the Filipinos' consent. Shortly after we've taken control of the Philippines, President McKinley decides that the Filipinos are not ready for self-government. And therefore, the United States will annex the Philippines. See, the Teller Amendment didn't apply to the Philippines. It only applied to Cuba. So now we annex the Philippines, and the Filipinos now, instead of seeing us as liberators, see us as conquerors and rulers. And so they start an insurrection rebellion against us. It's known as the Filipino-American War, the least known war in American history. And it was quite bloody. Over a couple of years, 5,000 Americans were killed trying to put down this Filipino insurrection. What it showed is it's easy to acquire colonies. It's much more difficult to hold on to them. Over in the Caribbean, again, we've got that pesky Teller Amendment that prohibited us from annexing Cuba. But McKinley, again, has come to the conclusion that the Cubans are not ready for self-government. That if we simply pull out, some other country, England or Germany, would come in and take over. And so he rationalizes to the Cubans, y'all will be better off under our protection than anybody else's. So he gets the Congress to pass what's known as the Platt Amendment that sets up a protectorate. Over Cuba. Cuba technically is an independent nation, but ... it has to clear just about anything it wants to do through us first. It can't borrow money from any foreign country without our approval. It can't enter into any treaty with any foreign country without our approval first. It can't do business with other foreign countries without our approval. So they've got their independence in name only, but it's going to be a different situation in Cuba than you had in the Philippines. There's going to be no Cuban insurrection against American rule, because now the Cuban businessmen who are doing, remember, $50 million a year business with the U.S., realize it's in their best interest to cooperate. Now, they don't like it, and they're going to continually ask for their independence, but the ruling class in Cuba is following their own self-interest. And so now we've picked up this protectorate, which effectively makes Cuba a colony. We occupy and establish a protectorate over both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. We annex Puerto Rico against the Puerto Ricans' will. We acquire the Virgin Islands. We send troops into Nicaragua. We acquire a Panama protectorate over the Panama Canal Zone a little bit later. So yes, we're an imperialist nation, We've sent our military outside. We've conquered other people, and we're now ruling them. But this American empire is limited. We could have acquired much more territory had we decided to, but it didn't seem necessary. All we really wanted was the ability to do business in foreign markets. And as long as these foreign countries cooperate, then we don't want to go to the expense of conquering them and ruling them. We just want to do business there. We also gain this new respect from the rest of the world. Think of it like this. In your neighborhood back home, and almost every neighborhood's like this, there's some little kid that everybody picks on. He's scrawny, and everybody picks on him. Well, y'all go your different ways into different neighborhoods in your lives, and then let's say 15, 20 years later, you're all back in the neighborhood for Christmas or Thanksgiving, and you run into this little scrawny guy, only he's not scrawny anymore. He's 6'6", he has a 3rd-degree black belt in karate, and he's a Navy SEAL. Nobody picks on this guy anymore, right? That's the United States here in 1898. Everybody realizes we've come of age and that they have to consider what America's influence in the world is going to be now. So tell me then, why are the Teller and Platt amendments important? Consult with each other, look at your notes, think it through. All right, red zone, hurry up. Hurry up and get in. All right. Results say, kind of across the board, but the correct answer is B. They're contradictory statements of American policy towards Cuba. Very good. This new diplomacy now is going to be driven by our national interests. Old diplomacy driven by our ideals, now we make no bones about it that the new diplomacy is driven by our interests. Because now the United States is going to actively seek to protect our trade interests. Actively seek to protect our trade interest. We recognize really for the first time that foreign trade is a vital part of the American economy, and that if we don't have a viable foreign trade, that's going to limit and negatively affect domestic prosperity. So this is a goal that we must pursue. The government is now going to take a lead in establishing these opportunities and protecting U.S. businesses. Now it's going to be the State Department sending in professionally trained diplomats to deal with these governments, trying to get deals so that the American corporations can come in and operate freely. We're seeking to protect our trade interests here, begin to develop policy. And the open door notes, the open door notes of 1899 articulate this new policy. Remember, just before the Spanish-American War, we looked at Africa, and Africa had already been colonized and divided up. We didn't have a chance to do business there. and China was on the verge of being divided up. Well, after our victory with the Spanish-American War and our newfound prestige, Secretary of State John Hay sends a letter to all of the nations interested in doing business in China. And he basically says that the United States' position is that China should be an open door in which all nations can freely compete economically, that nobody should have colonies, that nobody should create exclusive trade zones. Everybody can do business there. Well, a couple of months go by and nobody really reacts to the open door notes. And so Hay sends another letter back out to everybody that basically said, well, since you didn't write back to me complaining about this idea, we assume that you like it, and now we're going to enforce it. The United States, fresh off this victory against one of the world's great powers, nobody wants to take us on at that point. And so the open door notes established this idea of pursuing American business interests, acquiring markets without acquiring the other necessary or component parts of imperialism, is going to be how we interact with the rest of the world. So the open door notes then become the basis for all later American foreign policy. Up through this very day, the open door notes are still at work. Now, not everybody agreed with it, but by now it's too late. The one country that really disagreed was Japan, because Japan had been looking at China as being the place where they'd expand and build the great Japanese empire. And now they're prohibited unless they want to fight with the United States. What it does is it puts the Japanese on a collision course with the United States that, 42 years later is going to turn into a direct conflict. We also take a more active role in Latin America here. In 1901, our buddy Teddy Roosevelt issues the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, issued in 1823, remember, said, you European nations stay out. Well, they had their own squabbles going on, didn't really pay much attention to what's going on over here in the Western Hemisphere, so we basically got away with a bluff. There's no way we could have enforced the Monroe Doctrine, but now we can. The Roosevelt Corollary now sets the United States up as the policeman of the Caribbean. In other words, we are going to be the force maintaining law and order. If some other country has a complaint against any of these Caribbean or Latin American nations, they got to bring it to us. You don't go and deal with Nicaragua yourself. You come to us, we'll deal with Nicaragua. And so it's again a stern warning for the Europeans to stay out of our sphere of influence, the Western Hemisphere. Well, Roosevelt, of course, leaves office. His successor, Taft, takes a less bellicose, less aggressive approach to this. His policy is known as dollar diplomacy. He says American investment in these third world countries will greatly improve these people's standard of living. It'll increase wealth, not only for the country, it'll provide profits for American corporations. So he'll begin supporting these leaders in these various countries who are friendly to American businesses. And very quickly, this turns into a cycle of corruption. that will support any left-wing or right-wing dictator as long as he doesn't try to interfere with American business. And if the people of that country start a rebellion against American-owned businesses, we expect that dictator to take our side and put down the rebellion against his own people. And so it's just as heavy-handed, but it's wearing what they would have called at the time a velvet glove. Wilson comes along, and Wilson, as you're going to see later on, out-Roosevelt's Roosevelt when it comes to foreign policy. Wilson will intervene more often in the affairs of these Caribbean and Latin American nations than even Roosevelt thought was a good idea. So lastly here it sets this up, this recurring problem first noted by William Appleman Williams. This continuing conflict between our interest versus our ideals. The things we have to do for our own good versus the things we'd like to see happen. And sometimes pursuing one costs us the other. And so instead of a black and white, you've got this big mushy gray area. What determines and what directs our foreign policy? And this then makes foreign policy an ongoing political issue through the 20th and into the 21st century. So let me ask you this. How did the new diplomacy differ from the old? How did the new diplomacy differ from the old diplomacy? Oh, yeah, I might need to do that. Yeah, we're still using it. If you want to think of it as bribery, that would be a good way to think of it, yeah. Okay, let's see what the results here are. Overwhelmingly, you say A, which in fact is the correct answer. The U.S. became more active in pursuit of our national interests. Very good. Now, take a quick break while I pull up the other slideshow here. Okay. Let's call it back to order here now. The United States in World War I. This is chapter 21. Now, before we get too far along, we're going to have to set up some background here. Because quite frequently, these history textbooks, and Henkin is guilty of this too, they jump from the Roosevelt Corollary right into World War I with no connective tissue to link these together. When in fact, the context is very important. You've got to understand the limits of the new diplomacy up to this point. let's say from 1898 through 1914, the new diplomacy was only concerned with American interests in Asia and Latin America. That this is where we were asserting our new activist interventionist role, Asia and Latin America. With regards to Europe, we were still pretty much following the old diplomacy. We were not involved in the internal affairs of these European countries. We didn't care who is in charge of these countries. Now, we had foreign relations, but we didn't really have policy to deal with Europe. We were still in George Washington's avoiding these entangling alliances. World War I is now going to tie together this phenomena of progressivism and the new diplomacy. Because as we seek our economic interest in the rest of the world, we're going to draw on this progressive legacy of reform and improvement and now try to apply it to the rest of the world. We can fix and create a better society here at home. Well, let's try to do that in the world as well. But during this period, we're really not taking a role. Even as though we're into the progressive era, we want people to follow our lead, but we're unwilling to be the leader. We still have this determination to extend and protect our commercial empires, but it's important to note here that we are not, in this period, seeking world domination. If we can do business profitably, that's fine for us. We're not trying to influence the rest of the world yet. And our involvement in World War I, then, also demonstrates this ongoing conflict between our interests and our ideals, very similar to the Teller and Platt amendments. So, what you've got then in Europe is a very precarious peace throughout most of the 19th century. There's a number of wars going on in Europe during the 1800s. That explains in part why they didn't pay much attention to us over here and why we got away with our Monroe Doctrine bluff. The big war in 19th century Europe was the Franco-Prussian War, which ended in 1870. As a result of this, you're going to have the creation of a balance of power. Now, the tensions in Europe are still very high. Some of the same pressures of industrialization and ethnic dislikes are going on in Europe. Plus, keep in mind that Europe is about this big and has as many people as the United States, which is this big. And so people are much more crowded together. Population densities are much higher. They have smaller economies. And so foreign trade and colonization had always been much more important to the Europeans than it had been to us. This sets up a very precarious peace that any one little thing could set off yet another war. But because of these system of alliances, the peace has barely been kept. After 1870, the two sides kind of divided Europe up into two heavily armed camps. You've got the Central Powers, shown here in green, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire as the main players. Then you've got the Allied powers consisting of Great Britain, France, and Russia. Now, of these alliances, everybody knows that the English, the French, and the Russians have an open alliance. If anybody attacks any one of these countries, the others will come to their rescue. Everybody knows that the Central Powers have the same type of agreement. And so nobody's willing to make a move on the other because both sides have so many weapons, so much ammunition stockpiled, such large armies, that this could result easily into the bloodiest war that humanity's ever seen. So everybody's a little cautious here. Now, having said this, some of these treaties and agreements are out in the open. Everybody knows about it. But then there's some secret ones too that are only between one or two countries. For instance, Serbia and Russia have a secret agreement just between them. Belgium and England have a secret agreement just between them. Nobody else knows about this. And so it's all full of espionage and counter-espionage and intrigue. We don't know who's really allied with what, and that makes this a very dangerous situation. In the context of the old diplomacy, the United States is not involved in either of these alliances. This is a European thing. It's not going to benefit us. We're only going to get dragged down, so we choose to stay out. Now, this is still a very volatile situation with these tensions still running very high. Everything starts to fall apart in August of 1914 with the assassination in Sarajevo. Go back to the map here real quick. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, their number 2 guy, has decided to go down to a recently annexed part of Europe known as Bosnia. And he's going to go and take a tour in the city of Sarajevo, the capital city of Bosnia. Now, Bosnia was annexed without their permission. The Austro-Hungarian army simply came in and took over Bosnia. And Austro-Hungary is also talking about taking over Serbia. Well, the Serbians are fiercely, adamantly opposed to this idea. So they see a chance to strike here. There is a nationalist group, or today we'd call them a terrorist group, known as the Black Hand Society. What a great name. As Franz Ferdinand is going to come down and take his tour through Sarajevo, the Black Hand Society plots his assassination. And they've got a pretty well set up plan here. As the motorcade is going down the street and Franz Ferdinand and his wife are riding in this open car, somebody along the street, one of the Black Hand members, is going to roll a pipe bomb out in the street, detonate it, and blow the Archduke up. Well, the first guy in line rolls his pipe bomb out, and it just keeps rolling, and it drops into the gutter on the other side of the street. Never blows up. Well, they've got a backup plan. A couple of blocks down the street, there's another guy with a pipe bomb, only he's sitting here waiting for the Archduke to come. He does something, we still don't know what, but he detonates the bomb that he's holding. He blows himself up. So far, not so good, right? Well, again, they've got backup plans. The motorcade immediately turns down a side street to get away. This is where we bring in the Serbian nationalist known as Gavrilo Princip, a Black Hand member. He rushes out of the crowd with a pistol, puts it point blank right at the Archduke's head, fires 3 rounds, and then shoots Sophie, his wife, twice as well. The crowd subdues Princip, and the motor car speeds away towards the hospital, but by the time it gets there, both the Archduke and the Duchess are dead. So, as you can imagine, let's go back to the map, the Austro-Hungarian government is pissed. Their second in command has just been assassinated. They demand that Serbia allow itself to be annexed. They now they now invade Serbia. Now, Serbia, remember, has a special agreement with Russia. So now when Austria-Hungary, don't write this down, don't just see how this all comes apart here. Austria-Hungary invades Serbia. Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary has a relationship with Germany. Germany now declares war on Russia. Well, France has an agreement with Russia so that when Germany declared war on Russia, France now declares war on Germany. Germany now declares war on France. To send their army to France, they go through Belgium, which has that secret agreement with Great Britain. Now Great Britain declares war on Germany. Austria-Hungary declares war on Great Britain and France. The Ottoman Empire pretty much declares war on everybody. And this thing has, within a matter of days, descended into complete and total chaos, which is where we'll leave it until Thursday. See you then. Oh, damn it. End meeting.